After class, I thought I was the only one left in the room, until I looked up and saw her waiting for me. A woman I'd never met before, older, confident, and yet, there was something in her eyes that changed everything. The classroom was nearly empty by the time I finally closed my notebook. Most of the students had already slipped out into the fading afternoon, their voices and footsteps echoing down the hall until only silence was left. I wasn't in a hurry. I never was. I liked the quiet moments after class, when the room held a kind of stillness, the sunlight pooling across the desks in long, golden streaks. I bent down to gather my things, tucking my pen into the spine of the book, when I felt it, eyes on me. That strange, undeniable awareness that someone is standing just outside your focus, waiting. I looked up, and there she was. Leaning casually against the doorframe, arms folded loosely, was a woman I didn't recognize. She wasn't a student. She wasn't dressed like one either. A tailored jacket hugged her frame, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, catching the last of the sunlight in a way that made it glow faintly gold. She looked composed, the kind of composed that comes with years of knowing exactly who you are. But her eyes, that was different. They weren't cold or distant. They were watchful, yes, but there was a softness in them, a quiet curiosity. As if she wasn't there by accident. For a moment I froze. I was 24, still figuring out my path, still fumbling through what life was supposed to look like. And here stood someone who, by all appearances, belonged to a different world entirely, confident, certain, self-contained. And yet, she was waiting. For me. I tried to cover my surprise, stuffing my laptop into my bag, but the question circled in my mind, relentless. Why would someone like her be here, now, watching me? The sound of the hallway faded until the only thing I could hear was the faint rhythmic tap of her fingers against the wooden frame. Slow, unhurried. Like she wasn't in a rush to be anywhere else. I should have said something. But all I managed was a half smile, a polite nod, the kind you give a stranger. And yet, it didn't feel like we were strangers. There was something in the way she held herself, a familiarity I couldn't quite place. The last student left the room, the door clicking shut behind them. Suddenly it was just the two of us, the golden light stretching across the floor, the air thick with a quiet tension I didn't know how to name. She tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth curving in the faintest of smiles. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not intimidation, not awkwardness, but a pull. Subtle, magnetic, impossible to ignore. I didn't know it then, but that glance, the way she lingered there, waiting, was about to change everything. She didn't move right away, just stayed leaning against the doorframe with that calm composure that seemed to belong entirely to her. Finally she spoke. "Do you have a minute?" Her voice caught me off guard. Low, steady, with the kind of warmth that makes you pay attention without meaning to. It wasn't the rushed voice of a student running late, or the sharp authority of a professor giving instructions. It was measured, intentional, like every word had been chosen before it left her lips. I nodded, a little unsure. "Yeah, of course." She stepped into the room, the sound of her heels soft against the linoleum floor. The classroom felt different instantly. Not so empty anymore. Not so familiar. Her presence carried a kind of gravity, like the air had shifted to make space for her. "I noticed the way you stayed behind," she said, her eyes flicking briefly to the open notebook still on my desk. "Most people rush out as soon as the lecture ends." I shrugged lightly, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I guess I like the quiet after. It gives me time to think." Her smile deepened, just slightly. "That's a rare quality. Most people try to avoid silence." I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I just offered the truth. "Sometimes silence says more than words." She tilted her head, studying me in a way that wasn't invasive, but intent. As if she was looking past the surface. "You sound older than your years." I gave a nervous laugh, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know if that's a compliment." "It is," she said softly. There was a pause then, the kind that didn't feel awkward at all. Just full. I noticed the details I'd missed at first, the faint silver threads in her hair that shimmered under the window's fading light, the careful grace in the way she folded her arms, the quiet steadiness of her gaze. She looked like someone who had lived enough to carry stories in her eyes, stories she rarely told. She asked about my studies, what I was working toward, what I hoped to do. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I answered honestly. I told her about the uncertainty, the way I sometimes felt I was drifting without a map, trying to make sense of where I belong. Normally, I would have kept that to myself. But her presence, her attentiveness, made it feel safe to admit. When she spoke about her own path, she didn't dress it up. She admitted that her journey hadn't been straight, that she had taken turns she hadn't expected. Her candor surprised me. Most people her age, people I looked up to, spoke as if their lives were neat, polished stories. But hers sounded real. Human. The strange thing was, the age difference didn't feel like a barrier in that moment. If anything, it felt like a bridge. She had lived the questions I was still learning how to ask. By the time our conversation paused, I realized I wasn't wondering anymore why she had waited for me. I was wondering what else she might be willing to share, what else I might learn simply by being near her. We left the classroom together, our footsteps echoing in the nearly deserted hallway. The university always felt different after hours, emptier, softer somehow. The chaos of the day gave way to a quiet that carried its own weight, every sound amplified against the long stretch of tile floors and tall windows. She walked beside me, not behind, not ahead. Side by side, our strides fell into rhythm almost immediately, like we had been walking together far longer than just a few moments. I could feel the faintest brush of her sleeve against my arm when our steps drew close, subtle but enough to make me aware of the space between us. How narrow it suddenly felt. "Do you always stay so late?" she asked, her voice carrying easily in the stillness. "Not always," I admitted. "But sometimes it's easier when the halls are quiet. No noise. No pressure. Just space to think." She gave a small smile. "I understand that. I used to feel the same when I was younger. But even now, I find myself drawn to the quiet corners of places like this. There's something comforting in the silence." We passed a row of lockers, the fluorescent lights above humming softly. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. There was no rush in the way she walked. She carried herself with an ease that I envied, like she had already wrestled with the questions I was still stumbling through. As we reached the end of the hallway, she slowed. "Would you like to grab a coffee? There's a little cafe just across the courtyard." It wasn't a demand, or even a suggestion dressed in politeness. It was an invitation. Simple. Open. I nodded before I even thought about it. "Yeah. I'd like that." The cafe was quiet when we entered, the soft hiss of the espresso machine filling the air along with the rich, earthy smell of roasted beans. Warm lights spilled from hanging lamps, casting everything in a gentle amber glow. We found a small round table tucked near the window, away from the few scattered students hunched over laptops. Sitting across from her felt different than standing beside her. There was no longer the distraction of movement, no steps to follow or doorways to pass. Just her, directly in front of me. Her attention felt steady. It was rare, that kind of focus. Most people listen only halfway, waiting for their turn to speak. But she wasn't like that. She asked about my classes, about what drew me to my field. Her questions weren't surface level. She wanted to understand, not just hear. And when I admitted that sometimes I felt like I was floating, uncertain, restless, she didn't dismiss it or tell me I'd figure it out. She just nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "I remember that feeling well," she said quietly. "I think it's part of being young. But sometimes the restlessness never fully goes away. You just learn how to live with it." Her honesty disarmed me. It was strange, comforting, even, to hear someone so composed admit to something so uncertain. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe I wasn't so alone in the questions that kept me up at night. I leaned back, wrapping my hands around the warm cup in front of me, and realized that this wasn't just a casual chat. This was a connection, unexpected, unplanned, but already beginning to pull at something deeper inside me. The cafe had grown quieter as the evening stretched on. A few students came and went, their laptops and notebooks tucked under their arms, but our little corner by the window remained untouched, as though the world outside had forgotten us. The golden light from the hanging lamps softened the edges of her face, and for a moment I caught myself staring. She didn't seem to notice. She was too focused on stirring her coffee, the spoon making the softest clink against the porcelain cup. We had been talking for what felt like hours, though in truth, it couldn't have been more than 40 minutes. About school, about her career, about the strange in-between spaces we both seemed to live in. I found myself telling her things I rarely admitted, even to friends my own age. That I didn't have it all figured out. That sometimes I felt like I was trying to catch up with a version of myself I hadn't become yet. She listened without judgment, her eyes steady on mine whenever I grew unsure. And then, just when I thought the conversation had reached a lull, she said something I didn't expect. "Do you ever feel," she began slowly, "like you have to hide parts of yourself, just because of how the world might see them?" Her words hung there, suspended between us. I leaned in slightly, trying to read her expression. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping briefly to the table. For the first time that evening, she looked almost uncertain, her confidence giving way to something softer, more fragile. "I mean," she exhaled, her voice quieter now, "I'm in my 40s. And sometimes I catch myself wanting things, feeling things, that don't fit into the neat little box people expect from me. A woman my age is supposed to have everything sorted, everything under control. But the truth is, sometimes I don't. And I wonder if it's easier just to stay quiet. To keep those parts of myself hidden." Her fingers brushed the edge of her cup, almost absently, and I realized that in her confession there was more than just words. There was a vulnerability most people never let slip. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt the weight of her words press into my chest, and another part wanted to ease it somehow. But instead of searching for something clever, I just let silence fill the space. The kind of silence that said, "I'm listening. I see you." Our hands rested on the table, not quite touching, but close enough that when her fingers shifted slightly, I felt a faint electric awareness spark between us. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't quite intentional either. Just that delicate line in between, where hesitation and desire coexist. I looked up and found her watching me. Not the way one glances at a stranger, but the way someone studies a page of a book they're not sure they're ready to read aloud. In that look, in that moment, I realized she wasn't just waiting for my answer. She was waiting to see if I understood. And I did. When we finally stepped out of the cafe, the night had settled in fully. The courtyard was mostly empty, lit by a scattering of lampposts that cast soft halos of golden light onto the stone path. The air carried that early evening coolness, the kind that sinks in slowly, brushing across your skin before you realize you're shivering. She folded her arms loosely across her chest as we walked, the faintest tremor of a chill passing through her shoulders. It was such a small thing, but I noticed. I noticed the way her breath left in a thin cloud in the air, the way she instinctively leaned into her jacket though it wasn't enough. Before I could second-guess myself, I slipped mine off. "Here," I said quietly. She looked at me, her eyes softening in surprise. "Oh no, you don't have to." But I was already holding it out. "You're cold." For a moment, I thought she might insist. But then she smiled, faint, hesitant, and allowed me to drape it over her shoulders. As the fabric settled, my hands lingered there just a fraction longer than necessary. I could feel the warmth of her through the thin barrier of clothing, the slight curve of her shoulders beneath my palms. She didn't move away. Instead, she glanced up at me, and in that brief silence, the air between us shifted. Her eyes met mine with an intensity one hadn't felt before, quiet, searching, as if she was weighing something unspoken. The street around us was still. Just the faint hum of a distant car engine, the rustle of a tree in the breeze. But in my chest, everything felt louder, the steady thrum of my heartbeat, the awareness of how close we stood, the unspoken question hanging between us. I let my hands fall back to my sides, though every part of me wanted to hold on just a little longer. She adjusted the jacket lightly, her fingers brushing the fabric with a kind of tenderness that made me realize it wasn't about the coat at all. It was about what it meant, that I had noticed, that I had cared. We kept walking, slower now. Her shoulder brushed against my arm once, then again, and neither of us stepped aside. The distance between us had narrowed in more ways than one. At one point, under the soft glow of a lamppost, she stopped and turned slightly toward me. There was no smile this time, just a look, steady, vulnerable, unguarded. I couldn't bring myself to speak. And maybe words would have ruined it anyway. Because in that silence, in that gaze, everything was already being said. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed, not with declarations or bold gestures, but with the simple weight of a jacket on her shoulders, and the realization that neither of us truly wanted the space back that we had just given away. We walked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but thick with things either of us could quite say. The courtyard stretched into quiet streets, and our footsteps fell into rhythm again, steady, unhurried. Every so often, our hands brushed by accident, at least that's what I told myself. Each time it happened, I felt that faint electric pull, the awareness that her nearness wasn't something I could ignore anymore. She was the first to break the silence. "You remind me of something," she said softly, almost to herself. I turned to look at her. "What's that?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed ahead on the dimly lit street. "Of what it feels like, to be really seen." The words hit me harder than I expected. There was something raw in them, something that carried both gratitude and sadness. As if being truly seen wasn't something she was used to anymore. I swallowed, unsure what to say. "You mean, people don't see you?" She gave a small laugh, though it wasn't light-hearted. "Not really. They see the roles I play. The expectations. A woman in her 40s is supposed to be stable, composed, maybe even invisible. We're not supposed to want too much. And if we do, it makes people uncomfortable." Her honesty pressed against me, heavy and vulnerable. I slowed my pace without realizing it, just to stay in that moment with her. "You don't make me uncomfortable," I said quietly. She glanced at me then, her eyes catching the lamplight. There was something unguarded in her expression, something that made my chest tighten. But almost as quickly, she looked away again. "That's kind of the problem," she murmured. We stopped at a corner where the light spilled across the sidewalk, breaking the darkness into softer shades. She turned slightly toward me, and for the first time that night, I saw hesitation written clearly on her face. Not in her confidence, not in her presence, but in the way her fingers curled loosely at her side, as if she wanted to reach for something but couldn't. I felt it too, the tug-of-war inside me. Part of me wanted to close the space, to tell her that whatever lines we thought existed didn't matter. But another part reminded me of the difference between us. The years, the expectations, the way people might see us if they knew. The conflict settled heavy in my chest. And yet, in that heaviness, there was also clarity. What I wanted wasn't just about attraction. It was about her. The way she carried herself. The way she listened. The way she let herself be vulnerable when she didn't have to. Her hand brushed against mine again, barely, maybe even accidentally. But this time it lingered. Just long enough to feel the warmth of her skin against mine, the deliberate pause before she pulled back. Either of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence said enough, that we were both standing on the edge of something we couldn't yet name, something fragile, something we weren't sure we were ready to claim. By the time we reached the university gates, the night had grown still. The campus behind us was quiet, the windows of the old buildings glowing faintly in the distance. Beyond the gates, the streets stretched out into the city, the world waiting to pull us back into separate lives. We stopped without planning to, both pausing beneath the tall iron arch. A lamppost stood nearby, casting its glow across her face, softening the lines around her eyes, catching the faint shimmer in her hair. For a moment, I just looked at her, really looked, and I thought about how strange the night had been. How unexpected. How impossible it would be to pretend that nothing had shifted between us. She lingered in that quiet with me, her hands resting lightly on the lapels of the jacket I had given her. The fabric looked almost too big on her, and yet she wore it as if it belonged. "Well," she said softly, breaking the silence, "this is where I leave you." There was a finality in her words that tugged at something inside me. I didn't want this to be the end. I wanted more, not just more time, but more of her. The way she listened. The way she made the world slow down without even trying. I drew in a breath, forcing myself to speak. "I don't think I'll forget tonight." Her eyes lifted to mine, steady and searching. Then, after a moment, she stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her through the cool night air. Her hand rose slowly, almost tentatively, and came to rest against my arm. Her touch was gentle, but steady, her fingers curling just slightly into the fabric of my sleeve. "You don't have to," she whispered. The words carried more weight than they should have, simple as they were. They held a promise, not of certainty, not of something defined, but of possibility. For a moment, the world around us seemed to fade. It was just her hand against my arm, the warmth seeping through the fabric, the faint scent of her perfume carried on the night breeze. I felt my chest tighten with something that was both longing and peace at the same time. She let her hand linger there, then pulled it back slowly, as though reluctant to break the contact. But when she stepped away, she left behind something I couldn't ignore, the knowledge that this wasn't just chance. That she had seen me, and that I had seen her, and neither of us wanted to let that go. "Then maybe," she said softly, her voice carrying just above the quiet hum of the street. "Maybe this isn't the last time." I watched as she turned and walked into the night, the glow of the lamppost catching her silhouette until it faded into the distance. I stood there a long time after, the cool air wrapping around me, the faint warmth of her touch still pressed into my sleeve. And I knew, whatever came next, however uncertain, it had already begun.